Let's continue speaking about issues to do with foreign policy and I suppose South Africa's connection to all of that. The BRICS leaders meeting, of course, for the last day of the summit in the Russian city of Kazan today. President Vladimir Putin has called for BRICS to work together, at least the members in that particular alliance, to understand perhaps what's been said, what hasn't been said, and everything else connected to that. Let's bring in Khayelihle Khumalo, part of our international desk here at SABC News. Thanks for popping by as always. Thanks very much indeed.
Fantastic.
It's great to see you. There's so much to unpack, quite frankly, about what has been said already at the summit. Perhaps we can just pick up from the remarks made by the president just a short while ago, really reiterating details that aren't news. South Africa's opposition to Israel and committing genocide there, but also making interesting remarks yesterday around the expansion of BRICS being a beacon of hope for the global South.
Well, very much so, and especially in the context of South Africa, a lot of the discussions really centered from the resolutions that were taken from the Johannesburg leg of BRICS. Obviously, now it's a continuation of the new decision, the issue around, for example, the current situation in the Middle East, where President Cyril Ramaphosa is emphasizing that this is a genocide, what is happening in Gaza, and talking about the hostilities that continue, really affecting the humanitarian aid, affecting the most vulnerable, the women, the children, and so many people as well, but also emphasizing as well, as per also the declaration that has been adopted by the leaders in Kazan, where they emphasize the peaceful resolution of conflicts. We know that in Africa we do have our own pockets of conflict, the current situation in Sudan, a very untenable situation as well in the Sahel, where the terror activities are impeding the day-to-day life activities in that part of the continent, but also really in the main, what has been really interesting and really coming out from so many leaders is, of course, the issues around the global reforms, whether you're talking about the UN Security Council, and as we know that there is a heated debate for Africa to be included in this all-important institution, because a bulk of the issues really are coming from the African continent and many parts of the world as well. So, but also a very interesting issue as well with the attendance of the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Obviously, the Ukrainians are not fairly ecstatic about this.
Absolutely. In fact, we're beaming live visuals of the situation inside the room where all these leaders are meeting, making their closing remarks, watching very closely, by the way, to see if Antonio Guterres will be speaking. As soon as he does, I might have to interrupt you so we can listen to him. I'm sure you don't mind. Okay. Speaking about reform in the United Nations Security Council, I mean, Ramaphosa has gone on to mention that the UN, as it exists, is actually not representative of the current geopolitical setup in the world. I wonder, though, how much of the influence that BRICS has could shift the dial insofar as that is concerned?
Well, most certainly, and especially, I mean, you look at the recent UN General Assembly, that has been a really talking point. How do you make sure that the UN Security Council is responsive enough, is quite rapid in making sure that the resolutions that are taken, and also so many bodies, you know, whether also the UN General Assembly as well, they're quite more also representative in terms of the regions. So that has been a very burning issue. But also apart from that, I mean, for example, it's been really interesting listening to President Putin talking about the global financial architecture, saying that it's still skewed. You know, the developing world are still bearing the brunt of the exorbitant cost in terms of the loans, really saying that it's high time that these particular issues being focused upon. But obviously for Russia, this is a very critical moment for them to call for these reforms, with the sanctions really having an enormous impact. That's why they're calling for these alternatives, so that they're able to evade a very enormous impact of sanctions.
We were hoping at the start of this particular gathering that a lot said about de-dollarization, finding another way of conducting international trade. How much of attention has that received?
It's been very interesting because obviously you have the new development bank president, the former Brazilian president Dilma Rousseff. On the very first day of this summit, President Putin actually met her, where they were talking about the issue around, I think now the emphasis is around the usage of the national currencies, because Putin is saying this is about avoiding the geopolitical risk Obviously, because of the dominance of the dollar, it was very easy for Russia to really have all these sanctions imposed on them, given the dominance of the US dollar. So I think the emphasis now is around the usage of the national currencies. But also it was really interesting even today at the start of the third day of the summit, where President Putin was saying that when you look at trade, for example, between China and Russia, a bulk of their trade now, they're using their own local currencies. Something also that is quite interesting because, I mean, at the very start of this summit, also President Putin meeting with President Xi, calling him a dear friend. And I think there was a point where they had an issue with the translation, President Putin speaking in Russian, and obviously Prime Minister Modi of India, for example, in that instance, speaking in Hindi, saying, look, we don't need translation, we can literally hear each other. So it's been really interesting to have these banters between the leaders, showing really the solidarity that they're trying to fortify.
Yeah, who would have thought that this is where it would be, given the histories of some of these countries, at least the history of the relationships that they shared. Elsewhere, heads of government of Commonwealth countries, I think is what they call them. They've also been meeting for their own particular gathering. Perhaps let's just begin with just making sense of what's emerged out of that. I know there's been a lot of focus, for example, on reparation for transatlantic slavery that took place many years ago.
Well, absolutely, and quite a very important moment for the Pacific island of Samoa and Apia. So this is where the Commonwealth Summit is taking place, but it's also a very important time for this organization that has been facing also criticism, given the legacy of the British Empire. But obviously, during the course of the years, you've had Rwanda and Togo joining. These are mainly former French-speaking countries, no legacy whatsoever or vestiges of the British colonial past, but also having joined voluntarily. But obviously for the Commonwealth, it's about shedding that past as well. But it's also a very important moment because this is the first one without Queen Elizabeth as a head. So for King Charles III of Britain, this is quite a very important moment. The issue of reparation, that has been a very key issue, and especially for those Caribbean islands, your Jamaica, and so many of them. So they've been pushing this issue. But for UK, this is a very tough subject really to really delve into, especially because as much as when King Charles addressed the Commonwealth Summit in Rwanda, that was in 2022, he spoke about the very terrible past, the slavery and the atrocities that were committed, but there was no apology issued. And there was a point where he visited Kenya as well, where there was this expectation that it's high time that UK acknowledges the turbulent history behind the Commonwealth. But obviously we're going to wait with bated breath. Quite a lot of issues as well expected. The election of the new Secretary General, as you know, that's Miss Scotland, her term will end in March 2025. Lesotho's Joshua Sepita is one of the nominees. So he has been lobbying and really just trying to get support from so many countries.
Yeah, I wonder how you reckon King Charles has responded to what I think are changing times. You know, there's certainly been a different reception to the British monarchy, for example, in some of these countries. You're having much more younger, enthused politicians who have to interact with the king. He was heckled at some stage at the tail end of his address. And this is a person, I suppose, who is dealing with his own issues back at home, so to speak. I mean, what's your kind of reading as you've been watching the summit unfold about how he's just responded to what's been taking place?
Obviously, it's a very tough time for him. And I mean, like you spoke about the tackling incident as it's happened in Australia, where one of the MPs really just, a lady stood up and said, "You're not my king, you're not representing my interest," and really reflecting on that colonial past, saying that it's high time that a nation like Australia, it's high time that they really have their own head of states, because, you know, the British king is still the head of states of Australia, New Zealand, and so many of the countries. Especially because now you have so many young people who are really full on about the historical situations that you have seen. So I think they call them woke. So they're really very outspoken about these realities where they want to craft a new landscape. And really just especially because obviously UK itself going through its own, just situation where, the cost of living crisis, it's a big issue, especially for the Labour government parliament, Ayanda, they have been really calling for the issue of the reparations. But now things have changed. The Conservatives are out of power. So 10 Downing Street is occupied by Prime Minister Stammer. Is he going to lead that issue? So far, we do understand that they're not quite eager now to talk about it, because now they are in power. So if you talk about reparations, how will it work out, especially when you're facing your own economic situation? And we do understand South Africa will be represented by Deputy Minister of DECO, Thandi Moraka.
All right, yeah, I mean, what you say on the opposition benches sometimes changes dramatically once you're finally in office. Khayelihle Khumalo, thanks as always for popping by, helping us make sense of all these important issues. The Commonwealth Summit that's also reaching its tail end, as well as the BRICS Summit, the 16th of its kind, currently unfolding in the city of Kazan in Russia.